Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is Ukraine War Frontline update for the 19th of May 2023, so it's a little bit later than normal. Life gets in the way, doesn't it, sometimes? So let's go straight to the northeast sector, the Kupiansk to Svatva to Kreminna front line, which looks a little bit like this on my map. Not too much has taken place along this front line. A few of the usual suspects, Novoselivska, which is just by Kuzumivka there, a repelled attack there, Stedomakivka. There's been repelled attacks in Mazyutivka. The Russians have claimed that they have repelled two reconnaissance groups around the Kupiansk direction and two reconnaissance groups, Ukrainian reconnaissance groups around the Dobrova area here. Deep State map has a little bit of change of territory in the Russians' favor there, just literally like, moving the line from there to there instead to there. So like minimal movement there. There is something to be said of the ISW Institute for the Study of War, the American military think tank, says something of what's been going on in the area. Ukrainians have reported that Russian forces are recruiting additional bars, those are reserve forces, and Storm Z or Storm Z, those are assault formations composed of criminals to operate in the Liman direction, and that this recruitment signals that Russian forces are critically exhausted. I would agree with this. So what appears to have happened is that as the flanks of Bakhmut are crumbling for the Russians, not only have they sent some of their Wagner troops from, I presume, in the center of Bakhmut to the flanks, as the lines in the center get smaller and smaller, they're possibly able to send some troops from their own from their own lines, but also they have sent reserves from the Kreminna area and arguably or apparently from the Adivka area, and I'll come to detail that in a little while. That, of course, means that these other lines are going to be running short on manpower, and so therefore they are recruiting for criminals. And also, we know that reserves have come from Belarus, shipped by train through to Luhansk. So there's about 200, I think, personnel there and some equipment too, and they have fed into the Luhansk region too. So I think that is another sign that the Russians really have culminated, not just in Bakhmut, but right up and down the front line. I think that they are in desperate need of reconstituting, of reinforcing, of mobilizing. They really need to do a mass mobilization, but they're not doing that for political reasons. And as a result, I think they are in serious jeopardy of the Ukrainians being able to have a really effective counterattack. They just don't have the personnel up and down the front, and their winter offensive has amounted to the square root of bugger all, and that is not a good look for the Russians. So, yeah, moving on to Bakhmut, there has been, in fact, if we go to the top, they do most of their stuff on Bakhmut at the beginning of their piece now. I guess maybe the first, we'll go to Vuhledar, just look at the maps that come towards Bakhmut. So starting up in Dvorichna, you can see they're pushing in Mazyutivka, coming on further down south, some push towards, you've got Nevska there, and then pushing in Bilohorivka. I think Bilohorivka has seen some fighting. I think there has been a little bit of movement potentially of lines around there. In fact, I think Deep State map has, while they gained some here, I think the Russians might have lost minimal amounts of ground there in Bilohorivka. And there's still this disagreement over this refinery or whatever it is. I forget what kind of installation that is there, where Syriac map's a pro-Russian mapper, has that under Russian control. Deep State map does not, so that's why I still have that contested there. So we come all the way down to Bakhmut. So just to let you know how my mapping works, and it is a little bit odd. So as soon as you basically get to here, get to this tiny settlement of Sako Vansetti, my mapping changes. So that normally my maps really are about the red line because the Russians have been on the offensive. So this is where the Russians are. The blue line is a little bit more arbitrary, as in it is just behind the red line at having some amount of gray zone, but really it's looking at the red line, and that's a more certifiable line with regard to the different sources that I use. But as soon as you hit here, the blue line now becomes a Russian front line, as according to one of my three mapping sources that I'm trying to accumulate here into one single source, my source. So the blue line here is Andrew Perpetua's Russian control line. The red line is Suryak Maps, who's a pro-Russian mapper, their idea of where the Russian lines are. And then when it comes onto the yellow line, that's Deep State Map, which is a pro-Ukrainian mapper saying where the Russian lines are. So these are all Russian lines, and they all kind of disagree with each other to some degree. Now, Andrew Perpetua hasn't been able to speak to his sources on the ground in Bakhmut. I think it's all a bit tough there, so he's been unable to speak to them. So this is somewhat. This could be. It could be that the Russians are further back from the blue line. Now, interestingly, the pro-Russian mapper and Deep State haven't really changed their lines in the northern area at all, and only marginally in the south. Now, Deep State map. It's not like they're not doing mapping, because they've changed elsewhere, and in fact Deep State Map have agreed that the Russians have lost some ground in Saku Vansetti and have changed their mapping there. But as soon as you hit like the main Bakhmut area, Deep State Map just hasn't updated pretty much for 48 hours. So I really do think that they're just adhering to operational security there, and they're just not reflecting what's going on. So I think the Deep State Map line is out of date. The Suryak Map line is more interested, I think, in the gains that the Russians are making in the center of Bakhmut. They have reflected a little bit down to the south as well, but I think it's much more worthy. I think it's much more sensible to take Andrew Perpetua's lines as to what's going on north and south, but inside the city it does change a little bit. Okay, before we get into the city, let's look at what's going on to the north. We have, as I've said, Saku Vansetti here. The Ukrainians have opened up. You could argue they've opened up another front. I don't know if that's like it's as strong as that. If we look at the Wagner map itself, so this is from the Russians, from Wagner. They indicate that yes, they have lost some ground in Saku Vansetti. There's also there's four kind of areas. There's area here by Orokovo Vasilivka, and this area just to the north of Kromova, which the Ukrainians have taken quite a large piece of land. And then most of the advances has been done by the canal and on the way towards Klishchivka. So much so that the Russians have pulled in reserves, and I'll speak to you about that in a second. Well, if we go to what Prigozhin says, Russian troops withdrew half a kilometer in the northern part of northern Bakhmut, and opened the flanks, the leader of Wagner, Prigozhin, said. He also appealed to Shoigu and Gerasimov with a request not to give up on the settlement of Saku Vansetti and to keep it at any cost. He announced a loss of new territories, a threat to the flanks. The army units withdrew up to 570 meters from their positions in the north of Bakhmut in the area of the settlement of Saku Vansetti. So that's half a kilometer around there that the Russians have been pushed back. There is claims, and this builds into what I've been saying, that I don't think this is a major counteroffensive. I think there's just a bunch of really localized counterattacks that the Ukrainians are getting the sense that the Russians have properly culminated, and they don't have the ability to defend these areas at all, really. And so I've heard that in this area, the Russians have been pushed back by the Ukrainians using just one tank and artillery. So artillery hammering the trenches here, but really a tank and infantry and so on, and that's what's been able to get to switch a momentum. So it's not like they are throwing in a battalion around here. This is just minimal amounts of resources, which feeds into my theory that the Ukrainians are not drawing from any of their counteroffensive trained troops and new equipment that's being sent. This is all from existing people and equipment in the area and just being used to take advantage of the culmination. Rebar, pro-Russian source, says in the Vuhledar direction, the enemy continues to launch counterattacks in separate sectors of the front. In the vicinity of the village Saku Vansetti, Russian troops withdrew from their forward positions, taking up defensive positions in the settlement. In Bakhmut itself, Wagner PMC assault groups entered Jubilee Street north of Domino fortified area. At the moment, there are intense clashes with the AFU near the Children's Hospital. And then to the south, near Klishchivka, the Ukrainian troops are continuing to attack, pushing Russian forces away from the southwestern suburbs of Bakhmut. The Russian artillery are hitting bridges along the Konstantinivka to Ivaniska highway. So this has happened over the last few days, that there are bridges that are being targeted. The Russians are thinking, well, we need to stop the Ukrainians from supplying, reinforcing, and so on and so forth. However, the Russians, it really is a case of the Russians being losing significant territory to the north and to the south, but taking territory in the center of Bakhmut, or in the town of Bakhmut, and the Ukrainians unable to really hold on to that. Well, it's interesting that the war mapper map says that there are no uh, significant changes other than Ukrainians have advanced further in the center, but like they've only shown indicated here a tiny advance. Actually, according to Syriac maps, the Russians now control all of this territory to the north of that 00506 highway going out through Kromova, and really the Ukrainians are only holding in this southern area of the western outskirts. So if you look at my map, that is to say that, yep, there's pressure around here. Different mappers will claim different things. But as we come further into Bakhmut, we come past these areas that the Ukrainians have supposedly taken, those fields to the north. We come into the center. Now, my mapping then changes here. The blue lines from here onward now represent what the Ukrainians held yesterday. It's not Andrew Perpetua's line. This is now what the Ukrainians held yesterday, to give you viewing an indication of what Ukraine has lost in the last 24 hours from when I last mapped. Now, Syriac Maps claims that the Russians are up to here, and that seems to be pretty plausible. Andrew Perpetua says he doesn't know, but he indicates that that's probably where the Russians are at. Deep State Map has not changed the mapping in the center, as I said, for 48 hours, really. So I think that the Russians probably have caused the Ukrainians to lose this ground, but they are holding on the Ukrainians in this southern area, and that's apparently because the Russians just don't have the troops to both do the activity here and to push here as well. And that's another sign of culmination. This is the very end of the Ukrainians being in like the settlement of Bakhmut, and the Russians are unable to push them completely out all at once, which means they are suffering in terms of manpower. But again, this is all about the function that Bakhmut presents for Ukraine. There's no value in these buildings. These buildings. So and then it's going to be not buildings, and you're still going to be fighting. So what is the value that this gives to Ukraine? Well, it's fixing the Russian troops, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. It's about attriting the Russian troops. So the question is, if the fight then goes on to Ivanivska or this area here, or stays here with the Ukrainians being able to hit them with artillery or whatever, are they still able to attrit the Russian forces at the levels they have been, which is the reason why they have been defending that. So fixing, attriting, and that's pretty much that, because there is no other value to Bakhmut in and of itself. There's no intrinsic value. It's about the extrinsic value. It's the external value that it gives from other things, as I say, attrition and fixing. So, okay, that is what's going on in the center. Yeah, there are some other sources. Yeah, right. So now let's just look at a few other things to give us a sense of what's going on around Bakhmut. So this is War Translated, giving a translation of Prigozhin's Mouthpiece channel, which is a grey zone. This is a Telegram channel called the Grey Zone. So they have watched a video by the 3rd Assault Brigade assaulting a Russian defensive position near Bakhmut that resulted in 300 meters in progress in 16 minutes. Unable to understand how the Ukrainians can calmly send vehicles and infantry to walk along the wood line. Meanwhile, if Russians tried the same anywhere, they'd be burned on the approach. So this is a really fascinating insight. This is from the Russians. So if you're pro-Russian out there, these are your own guys reporting this and being amazed at how badly things are going on the flanks, as well as things might be going in the center. So every day for a week I wanted to post this video, but each time I missed the opportunity. Today, for the first time, I saw another boring video on the channel of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. So in other words, this is someone who is an ultra-nationalist, pro, or possibly a Wagner personnel himself, saying the Russian MOD is boring. Their videos are boring. Why? Because basically they're not telling the truth. From Bakhmut, it tells how army units hold the flanks and how they have everything perfect. Perhaps they decided to take over the agenda. Once again, just in case, I'll say the Russian armed forces are mostly good fighters, but what's the use to recruit 300, 500, or at least 900,000 of them when in view of the almost complete absence of a built-in combat control system in the troops, coherence of actions, communications, reconnaissance complex, fire support training, etc., they will simply be crushed as below in the video. Below in the video is how a week ago, the 3rd Assault Brigade Azov of the Armed Forces of Ukraine took the platoon strong point of the Russian Armed Forces, which is located 2.5 kilometers south of those positions they had taken a little earlier. That footage with the 72nd Brigade infantry fleeing from an enemy tank. Right, let's give you some context here. So what this guy is talking about is, and it's geolocated actually, I'll show you where it's that geolocation he gives is right here. Okay, and this is, so arguably this is no longer under Russian control. Deep State Map and Suryak still has this under Russian control. Andrew Perpetua does not. So he's complaining about these trench lines here just getting taken out by the Ukrainians, and he's saying this is just 2.5 kilometers south of where the 72nd Brigade ran away, and that was the Russians' conventional forces running away from the Ukrainian counterattack in this general area around here, and we saw lots of video footage of that taking place. So just to continue, he says, the assault itself lasts about 16 minutes, filmed in one shot. During this time, the enemy crosses 305 meters. Where are the handheld anti-tank weapons? Where are the anti-tank firing points with ATGMs, anti-tank guided missiles? Where is a minefield with TMs? Where are those tank mines, I think? Where is the fire support from the flanks, from perpendicular wood lines on the left and right? Why the F does the BMP, so that's the Ukrainian infantry fighting vehicle, ride slowly in open space for 15 minutes? What did they say in that video by the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation? We're burning enemy vehicles as they approach. Why were our servicemen simply crushed on foot? Probably the Wagnerites are to blame for this again, and not the commanders of the Russian forces, armed forces on the ground. I'll just say for myself that I can't imagine that we could go like this along the wood line, hiding behind vehicles where the enemy is on the defensive. Most likely, we would not even have had time to dismount from the vehicles. We would have been burned on the way. The enemy placed TM mines at all approaches. The BND could not even go to the line to pick up the wounded, so they were dragged through one more wood line. And when a group of VDV, airborne troops, Russian troops, was withdrawn only 300 meters to occupy a site in the grey zone, they were immediately cut off from the neighbouring wood line by enemy fire, preventing us leaving and gaining a foothold at a previously set point. And there it is, and that's a video they're referring to. So it's like, how has this happened? This is just not good, and it shows that the Russians are it's a bit of a shambles both north and south, which is what Prigozhin is saying as well. And yeah, it's just not looking good. Now here's a bit of footage I've cut off. You've basically got Russian troops in there. It zooms in on them, and then we have a Ukrainian tank. And why this is, I guess, oops. So let's get on larger for you. Okay. So we have a tank going up, and then essentially, and I don't know where this is. This is in Bakhmut area. This could even be what happens at Sako Vansetti. So you've got an IFV with troops that are getting out. That I think that's somewhere to the left of here, and you've got a tank that you've got Russians in these trenches, and then the tank just absolutely leathers the trenches. A couple of shots and then retreats, because when you do something like that, you're indicating to the enemy where your tank is. So what you want to do is fire your round off and then retreat away from the smoke about 100 meters if preferable. You got people running away, and then so on and so forth. And you got the troops coming in. Why I'm showing you that is this is combined commands maneuvers. So you've got infantry fighting vehicles, drone, infantry, tank, and they are coming together to take out a position, and they successfully do that, and it's just textbook stuff, right? When we see the Russians do their maneuvers, it's very rare that they combine. They do sometimes. There is footage of some, but there's an awful lot of footage of single Russian tanks just being sent in to get blown up, single Russian IFVs getting sent in to get blown up. And it's just, it's just chalk and cheese, arguably, between these two sides. So again, another report from the area. 3rd Separate Assault Brigade in Bakhmut is claiming significant success today. That's yesterday. Up to 700 meters of territory retaken along a 2-kilometer front. So 2-kilometer wide, advancing in 700 meters. There are 50 Russian killed in action, 100 wounded, and 4 prisoners. The counterattack involved the 1st Assault and 1st Mechanized battalions. So this kind of report is fairly common at the moment. It seems that the Ukrainians really are taking quite a lot of land with um, minimal losses themselves. Now, I'm not sure. This is a bit of footage. Now, this does look. It's not like it's not very springtime, so I'm not really sure if this is actually from then. 92nd Mechanized Brigade counterattack with the help of tanks near Bakhmut. That just shows you using several tanks at the same time to have a fairly organized offensive there, but I'm not 100% sure that is from yesterday. But that's come out, but it's nothing I've seen before. Actually, we'll come to that in a second. So, what I'm going to mention now is what's been going on around Klishchivka. So, listening to Andrew Perpetua last night, is saying that they're a bit unsure as to where the front line is around here, and it could be right here, it could be further back. The Russians have admitted they are not in this area, so Syriac maps here is inaccurate as according to the Russians' own claims, as according to Andrew Perpetua. He says that they are not in that area. They have, but it might not. It might be that the Ukrainians are not there as well. So it just depends where the front line is. Now, he's saying that what happened yesterday is that the Third Army Corps, the Third Army Corps were a group who, let's have a look here. So they're a group who got absolutely hammered in the initial sort of invasion. They are mechanized. They lost loads of equipment, absolutely hammered. Went back to Russia, reconstituted, then were sent down to Avdiivka, and they got absolutely hammered again and lost an absolute bunch of equipment, and then were sent back around here to reconstitute. And then, even though they failed twice, have been given a load of new stuff like T90s and loads of really BVNs, loads of really good bits of equipment, and had then been sent. There's some of the people who have been sent to Bakhmut to shore up the flanks. And apparently, yesterday they were basically lined up on this road here between sort of, I believe, Opitny and Mykolaiivka. And they got absolutely hammered by artillery and lost a load of troops and stuff. And so that was a bit of a disaster. So these guys have been hammered like 3 times, or they're in the process of being hammered again. But the idea is, what are the Russians trying to do? Well, they want to maybe have this as a defensive line. It looks like Klishchivka is going to fall. Will the Ukrainians go on to take these other points, Kodiamivka, Andriivka, and then move on to further afield? Is this part of a larger encirclement of Bakhmut? And I don't know that it is actually at the moment. So, if you're pro-Ukrainian, don't get your hopes up too much. I don't think they have the personnel to do that if they're not going to reinforce this with part of the counter-offensive, equipment and personnel. So I think this is more likely to be localized to establish a line, maybe that looks something like this. There's a high hill behind Klishchivka, somewhere around here, I think. I'd have to look at the topographic map, but it could be that's where the Russians try and hold on to. But I think the Ukrainians might try and get as much as they can with as little as they can. And they're doing that fairly successfully at the moment. So it really doesn't matter whether whether they lose Bakhmut to the Russians, as long as they are fixing and attriting the Russians in these positions. So what you've seen is the Third Army Arms Army Corps being sent to shore up these lines here, and that's exactly what they want. That is fixing those people there with decent equipment. And as a result, those people aren't elsewhere. They're not in Kreminna, or they're not in Avdiivka, or they're not wherever. And so therefore, to shore up these positions, they're having to bring in reserves from Russia and convicts, as according to the Ukrainians in this area. So this is what I was saying the other day. Bakhmut is it's been a 6-month shaping operation for this counteroffensive. This is what Syrsky said. No, it's what Zaluzhny said, sorry, the head of the Ukrainian armed forces. He's saying, sorry, guys, sorry to the people in the trenches here. And he said this, months ago, but, we need to be thinking about our counteroffensive. In other words, you are fixing the Russians here, you are attriting them, and that will play into our hands when our counteroffensive takes place. This is a massive shaping operation, and it is still it is still that, and it is more evidently that as the days go by, as the Russians are sending in troops to try and stop the flanks from completely capitulating. Well, the ISW says Ukrainian forces have seized the tactical initiative and made tactically significant gains around Bakhmut in the counterattack operations yesterday. These operations are a continuation of the localized. Thanks, computer. These operations are a continuation of the localized counterattacks that Ukrainian forces have been conducting for some days and do not reflect the start of a major new operation. Agree. Multiple Russian bloggers claim that Ukrainian forces drove through the Russian defensive lines south and southwest of Ivaniska and northwest of Klishchivka. Agree from the northwest. The mill bloggers also claim that Russian forces retreated from positions north of Sako Ivanseti. Agree to positions south of the settlement, but that Ukrainian forces have not yet entered the settlement. So the idea is there. I think they've used artillery and maybe just a single tank. Wagner Group financier Prigozhin claimed that Russian forces yielded 570 meters of territory north of Bakhmut, which is consistent with what the Ukrainians are saying. And Ukrainian forces have advanced 500 meters north of Bakhmut, that's what they said, and 1,000 meters south of Bakhmut. Ukrainian forces spokesperson Cherevati stated that Ukrainian forces advanced up to 1,700 meters in the past day, and the Ukrainian 3rd Separate Assault Brigade stated the brigade's counterattacks expanded the Ukrainian salient in the Bakhmut area by 2,000 meters wide, 700 meters deep. That's what I said. So Ukrainian officials indicated that Ukrainian forces have seized the battlefield initiative in the Bakhmut area. Cherevati stated that Ukrainians have regained that initiative and are forcing Russian forces to respond to Ukrainian actions. So this is exactly what the initiative means, is like, who is controlling what's going on? The Ukrainians are making Russians do stuff. They are making the Russians send reserves in from different areas of the front line. That means the Ukrainians have the initiative. They are dictating what is taking place. It might not be the case in the center of Bakhmut, but I would say that isn't really hugely important. The Russians will deny that, and they'll say this is a great victory and you are just coping. It's like, no, get a sense of what's going on in the whole area. You know, when you go back to this map and you look at this from afar, and you go, well, so what if they lose a bunch here? You know, what's going on in this whole area? How's this playing out? What are the Ukrainians forcing the Russians to do? Once you get an understanding of that, you realize that maybe losing a couple of roads here isn't the end of the world. You know, as long as that doesn't lead to further issues going forward, and they can maintain this straight line. If they're falling apart on the flanks and they're forcing the Russians to do things they don't want to do, then this is a success for the Ukrainians. So it goes on to say, Maliar stated that Russian forces have deployed most of their reserves to the Bakhmut area, very likely to the detriment of other areas of the front line. Precisely. Prigozhin claimed that Wagner forces advanced 260 meters in Bakhmut and that Ukrainian forces only control 1.28 square kilometers of the city. I'd say they probably control less than that now. One mill blogger optimistically claimed that Wagner forces increased their pace of advance following Russian ammunition deliveries to Wagner, though Prigozhin's claimed daily rate of advance has remained largely consistent. I don't know, maybe they might have gained a bit of pace in taking ground here. You can see that's quite a lot of ground they've taken over the last 24 hours. So I'd say that could well be true. And the Russians might have stepped up, as I'm pretty sure the Ukrainians would have pulled out because they're just getting hammered by artillery. It's just, suicidal to stay there. Wagner Group financier Prigozhin admitted yesterday that Wagner mercenaries are unable to encircle the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut, damn straight, due to the loss of stable flanks north and south of Bakhmut. So this is flipped. This whole theatre here has flipped. There's no chance of the Russians encircling the Ukrainians. The Russians are themselves now vulnerable to be encircled. But again, it depends how much the Ukrainians throw at this theatre. Prigozhin accused the Russian MOD of losing advantageous positions after MOD subordinated units retreated from their positions on Bakhmut's flanks necessary for an encirclement. This reminds me of listening to my twins play Fortnite, right? In different rooms, shouting at each other, blaming each other for why their squad or whatever it is, their threesome, quad, I don't know, it's Fortnite, whatever. They've been killed and they've lost the game or whatever, and they're shouting at each other and blaming each other. It's your fault for doing this. No, it's your fault. It's like, that's the Russian MOD and Wagner. It's your fault. No, it's your fault. Yeah, get it together, guys, because is showing a lack of cohesion. Actually, don't carry on as you are, Wagner and MOD. Prigozhin and Wagner affiliated mill bloggers are blaming Russian conventional forces for military failures in and around Bakhmut, but these efforts to blame Russian military for failures around Bakhmut are causing some ultra-nationalists to accuse Prigozhin of using the battle for Bakhmut to satisfy his own personal ambitions. So I think, long may this continue in Bakhmut, because it just shows how weak and incoherent shows a lack of cohesion that these Russian forces have in the area. Right, let's move on. But just before I go, Vuhledar's maps show that the Ukrainians are pushing in the Klishchiivka area, and that yellow area refers to what Syriac maps has agreed has been lost, which is this area here. So the Syriac maps yesterday had that in red. That has been lost as according to them, and I showed you that earlier. So that's just Vuhledar's map. I just thought I'd show you their mapping. Anyway, as we come down to Avdiivka, there is not a lot to report of Avdiivka. No real changes of exchanges of territory. This could well be because the Russians have sent a lot of their troops from the area up to Bakhmut. So this then leaves this a little bit weak. Now, I'm going to bring you on to Marinka. So Marinka, which has been not moving for a long time, and then the Russians started making some gains. According to Andrew Perpetua in his live stream last night, a really interesting segment, but, again, take these claims with a pinch of salt. He was saying that apparently Russians are really worried here because a load of troops were sent out from Marinka to Bakhmut. So they were doing fairly well. Well, fairly well. They were making some gains here, and now they've had a lot of their troops sent away. That they are worried that the Ukrainians are going to do a counterattack here and push them and push them all the way back to this heap, all the way back there. And that's what apparently the Russians, the chatter amongst the Russians is that this is now ripe for a counterattack because they have sent troops out to Bakhmut, which is entirely what I was just talking about, which is that's your shaping operation that takes troops from one place, which then makes that place weak, and that leaves that open for counterattack, and they could lose as much ground here as they in weeks as they've gained over the best part of the year. But I don't know whether that's actually going to happen. That is from Andrew Perpetua, and that those are his claims about what he's heard on certain channels. So as we come out of Marinka, I haven't heard of actually any activity there, just that sort of stuff. Vuhledar, quiet as far as I can work out. What has been going on in Zaporizhia, it's worthy of note, is that the Ukrainians have been absolutely hammering a whole bunch of places with GMLRS, guided multiple launch rocket systems. So places like Tokmak, Molochansk, which is just there, I think this place, Bilmak, and a number of places, obviously Melitopol as well, all around here have been hit by multiple launch rocket systems, which is an indication that the Ukrainians are softening up that area for a counteroffensive. Andrew Perpetua again was talking about, sorry to mention him so much, but he was talking about this island, and he's just couldn't believe it. But the Russians sent a Caliber missile and a KH. Was it KH-155, KH-55? It's the ship missile at this island, at this tiny island. Apparently it was at reconnaissance there, which is just people doing reconnaissance. He said that he can't believe that they wasted 2 cruise missiles that are not going to be particularly accurate. Their circle error probable means they're just as likely to land in the water as they are there at such a low value target. It's like, why are they not using artillery to do that and using those cruise missiles to do something of much greater value? It's like, it was literally laughing at that. It's just ridiculous. But anyway, there is aviation activity around here from the Russians still, but the Ukrainians themselves are also hitting places around the Kherson Oblast. The ISW says a Russian mill blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces conducted a failed raid across the Dnipro River in Kherson 2 days ago. The mill blogger claimed that Russian forces prevented Ukrainian forces from landing, but Ukrainian activity near the river delta islands has increased recently. Ukrainian forces have routinely conducted raids across the river for some time. Ukrainian officials have stated that Russian forces have artificially raised the water level in the Kakhovka reservoir, hindering Russian defensive operations. So it's a bit, they've shot themselves in the foot, apparently. Ukrainian Southern Forces Joint Press Center head Natalia Humenyuk stated that Russian forces flooded their own positions on the reservoir banks, sustaining losses and igniting a scandal. Humenyuk also stated that Russian forces rely on stolen boats for logistics to the Dnipro Delta Islands. And we've seen those boats. They are not using military boats. They're using just stolen commercial boats or private boats. And then it's sort of talk about partisan activity in Crimea. We've got the railway line being taken out around, was it around Simferopol? So the railway between Simferopol and Sevastopol, I think, is taken out. There are explosions in Crimea, in some of these other major places. I think Melitopol, possibly Berdyansk and Mariupol. I'm not 100% sure. There's just an awful lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that indicate that, yep, things are hotting up as far as the coming counteroffensives are concerned. Anyway, that's the Frontline update for today. Hopefully that's useful for you. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate all of your support for the channel. You are all wonderful. Well, most of you are wonderful. Some of you are slightly shy of wonderful, but you know, you're trying. You know, we can't all help ourselves when it comes to repeating Russian propaganda, right? So, you know, but I'm sure you get there. Anyway, take care. All the best. Speak soon.